Jean Sibelius has been one of the 20th century's most celebrated, neglected, appreciated, and misunderstood composers. Few of his pieces have been performed nearly to death, while others are largely ignored and unheard. The ones that are played are given mostly for the sake of their sweeping melodies, their patriotic fervor, or their dramatic evocation of nature. The great outdoors. These are the stereotypes that obscure Sibelius's most individual qualities and his most important contributions to the music of our time. Sibelius was an original, a visionary, even avant-garde artist. Paradoxically, he wrote conceptually advanced work using traditional, one might say self-consciously old-fashioned material. The story of his creative life is the evolution of a musical architect, an abstract sculptor in sound, and one who never attempted to disguise the strongly personal and romantic sources of his work. Sibelius was born in 1865. He experienced childhood in a rustic environment and was then drawn to music through naive improvisation, particularly influenced by nature. For example, his first little piece for piano and pizzicato violin was called Water Drops. As a student, he lived abroad and was part of a circle of radical bohemian artists. He rediscovered and became obsessed with the mythology and landscape of his native Finland. He studied the ancient texts, he listened to the wind and waterfalls, and attempted to write down their sound. These studies were the inspiration that led him with his friends, the painter Galen Kalela, the architect Saarinen, and the conductor-composer Kajanus, toward the creation of a romantic nationalist style that permeated all of the arts in their homeland and ultimately internationally. Sibelius is one of the last great romantic symphonists, but his development as a symphonic composer was just the opposite of his predecessors and contemporaries. Unlike Tchaikovsky, Bruckner, or Mahler, who wrote ever longer, programmatic, and elaborately scored works, Sibelius pared his symphonies down, concentrating them to the very bare essentials. He created an uncompromisingly spare language that ultimately he couldn't sustain. He lapsed into a silence. But silence had been stalking Sibelius for a long time. Already in 1912, Sibelius was at a creative crisis. Depressed by the gloom of Europe on the verge of the Great War, he had written a symphony of deepest lament and stark simplicity, the Fourth Symphony. It was written within the same few years as Stravinsky's Exotic Rite of Spring and Schoenberg's surreal and expressionistic Pierrot Lunaire. In many ways, Sibelius's symphony is conceptually a more avant-garde statement than either of those revolutionary works. On casual hearing, the Fourth Symphony sounds like the old northern harmonies of Grieg or Sibelius's own salon pieces like Valse Triste. Yet, its uncompromising abstract shape is like the cubist work of Picasso or Braque, and particularly the constructivist works of the painter Malevich. It presents a monochromatic architecture, an abstraction of despair, a psychological inner space. When you paint a picture such as this, when you write a symphony like the Sibelius Fourth, you're getting dangerously close to the point where the ideas are reduced to their ultimate simplicity, to the point where there can be no next work. This is exactly what happens to Malevich, Duchamp, and others who spent the rest of their lives playing chess and writing their memoirs. It's his last real symphony, the sixth, that is the subject of this program. Sibelius said of it, "While other composers are mixing cocktails of various hues, I am offering the public pure spring water." But it's not a typical symphony that ends with a triumphant conclusion or calm resignation. Rather, it ends with a question, a soliloquy, to be or not to be. And that timeless question Sibelius answers with silence. Throughout his symphonic career, he was obsessed with three aesthetic ideals. One was thematic unity. Sibelius wanted all parts of his work to derive from a single primal motive. Another ideal was continuous variation. Sibelius would allow his works to contain no exact repetitions, but rather strived to constantly evolve the material. A third ideal, and one unique to Sibelius, was what one might call formal deconstruction. He presented the traditional musical shapes of a symphony and then took them all to bits. Let's look now at the first movement of the Sixth Symphony. It's a sonata. Now, what do we expect from a sonata movement? First of all, we expect an exposition, a forthright, easily identifiable first theme in a main key, and then a second theme in a contrasting key. Then we get a development section in which the themes are varied and played off one against the other. And finally, a recapitulation which satisfyingly recalls and resolves all of the themes in one key. So then, statement, conflict, and resolution. But in this symphony, Sibelius begins not with a main theme, but with a variation, the first of many variations we're going to hear on the primal motif of the entire symphony. We hear it for the first time in the form of a disarmingly simple chorale. It's all built from 4 descending notes. A skip up of a third, and one more step up. A, G, F, E, G, A. It all comes down to these 4 notes introduced in the first few bars of the piece. But each time they recur, they will mean something very different. What do they say to us when we first hear them? What key are they in? That is an enigma. The opening theme, while harmonious, is not for a very long while in any clear key. It's hovering. It takes 31 bars to finally resolve onto a harmonic center, D. And not D major or D minor, but the ancient scale built on the note D, the Dorian mode. This mode is much used in ancient and medieval music and in folk music. It uses only the white notes, which gives it an old bardic sort of sound. You'll notice how much it is like a D minor scale, except at the top, where the 6th and 7th degrees have a much more serene, less pulling feeling. The D minor scale, the Dorian scale, Probably the most famous piece in recent years using the Dorian mode is Eleanor Rigby. Lennon and McCartney instinctively used this ancient scale to evoke a timeless, fatalistic quality, just as Sibelius did in writing his symphony. The symphony starts with a sad choral melody fashioned from the 4 primal notes. It's like an earlier chapter of Eleanor Rigby's life. It's a chorale whose parts have been deliberately put out of synchronization. The lines have all been blurred. Now, why should Sibelius present the theme this way? Does he mean to suggest the choral music of the Middle Ages, or the mournful droning of a folk tune? Or is it an image out of nature, the vast, slow movement of shadow over a plain, or folding of the aurora in the night sky? The specific illusion doesn't really matter. It's the time scale, the vast, slowly moving dimension of time that Sibelius wants us to feel. The music calls on us to be quiet and hearken to something larger than ourselves. Now, what was that? Did you hear that sudden twinge that seemed to disturb the calm flow of the strings, that little heart wound? Well, that's just what it is. Here, Sibelius introduces a new note, C sharp, a note not found in our serene ancient scale, but the leading note of the modern and melancholy D minor. He does this to suggest for the first time feelings, the human feelings of a listener or singer right now. This one note, C sharp, this chromatic C sharp chord, is filled with expressive association. It will cause the voices of the winds and brass to wake up and enter the flow of the theme. The new voices will gradually accumulate and transform the serene string theme into a song of great yearning, a yearning that leads inescapably back to the same heart-twinge C-sharp chord that started it all. Now the chord is hugely magnified and repeated in despairing passion. All at once, the brass and timpani enter on C natural, an inescapable discord in the lowest range of the orchestra. This C natural marks like a monolith the harmonic argument of this work. The C natural makes a huge crescendo into the second theme. This second theme is in total contrast to the first. It's all animation and dance and joy, yet it's also a variation of the primal theme. The 4 descending notes, the skip up of a third. This time, Sibelius uses them like this. He puts the second half of the theme first, playing with that skip of the third. And then he brings in the 4 descending notes. It makes a perky little theme. Cast in the form of duets, Sibelius's favorite device, it calls back and forth across the orchestra. Gradually darkening harmonies bring us to the eerie development section. Here is where Sibelius begins his deconstruction of the typical sonata. This development is an abstract texture. It's influenced by Sibelius's subtle observation of nature. Trios of treble strings dart about, overlapping and interlocking. The scoring suggests the gusting of wind through fir trees. Everything is in motion, yet time stands still. We feel we are hovering. Textural passages like this harken back to the development section of Beethoven's 6th Symphony. They also look ahead to the minimal music of Steve Reich. And then Sibelius, the philosopher, the deconstructor, intervenes. And we come to a kind of structural, psychological crisis. The music loses its direction, wandering uncertainly until the timpani silences it. Then in unison, the orchestra tries out modern experimental scales, searching for some route toward resolution, but finding only silence. Finally, after a disorienting tangle of scales, the orchestra unites and resolves toward C natural. That same C natural monolith that marked the identity of the ancient scale, Dorian. We're all ready now for the return of the opening theme, but we don't get it. Instead, the music breaks off into 4 quiet, melancholy bars. Then, before we know it, it all fades away into silence. It's an incomplete movement, a deconstructed sonata that leaves us in a void. As a second movement, Sibelius offers us a set of variations on a dance, an odd, sad waltz or mazurka. It's a claustrophobic souvenir of Sibelius's bohemian youth, of the world of salon music, valse triste, or pictorially speaking, the world of Edvard Munch. As in the first movement, everything comes from the first four notes of the primal theme, which rise and fall haltingly as the movement begins. The first and second violins begin to play a sad little tune, yet another variant of the primal theme. It breaks up into questions and inconclusive replies. The little fragments link up again in ascending, yearning scales, much like the ones we heard in the first movement. Now Sibelius begins his variations, but these are no ordinary variations. They don't change the character of the theme, nor do they ornament it. They're really a new sort of sound sculpture, this one much like a mobile. He uses time, speed, and sequence in a way a sculptor would use space, scale, and position. It might be helpful for you to know that each variation ends with a loud, low unison note in the violins. And then, suddenly, with the abruptness of a tape splice, Sibelius abandons his variations and thrusts us into a new sound sculpture. Takes a breath, and instead of the recapitulation of the mazurka tune we've been expecting, we get four resigned bars of music dying away into silence. So again, Sibelius has deconstructed a traditional symphonic movement, the theme and variations. The second movement, like the first, has ended inconclusively. It fades away, leaving us in a void. And now Sibelius takes up the typical third movement form of the symphony, the scherzo. The piece is propelled by two opposing rhythms. The first is a military drum-like march figure. We hear it right out at the start of the movement, played not by drums, but by strings. Locked in close unison formation, they trace a shape derived from the primal theme. Of course, any symphonic scherzo movement usually has a trio. And Sibelius writes one for this scherzo, not an ordinary trio, but a new kind of sound sculpture. He leads into it by establishing a new texture with two alternating chords marching regularly in place, first in the winds, then in the strings. It's like a military drill, 3 bars on, 3 bars off. Then, over all of this, Sibelius sets a primitive, almost oriental-sounding tune. It's played once, then repeated again in canon, first by two flutes, then by two flutes and a harp. It's a real trio. This scherzo movement, you'll be delighted to learn, ends loudly and decisively. But it's abrupt and dismissive. It's just too short. Through truncation, Sibelius has deconstructed the scherzo. We're thrown into silence. It's just a breath, really, before the last movement begins. The finale begins with a joyously swinging variation on the primal theme's 4 notes, descending syncopatedly from the treble. It's harmonized chorally and shifts with a little bump to a syncopated sing-song version of those same 4 descending notes. Sibelius pairs this phrase with another that is its mirror image, the notes rising up from the bass. They form a kind of colloquy between youth and age, innocence and experience. All at once, the tempo seems to become twice as fast, and a new dance-like theme is introduced. It, too, comes from the primal theme's first 4 notes. It soon develops into a rip-roaring fiddle tune. Sibelius uses the onrushing force of this tune to move us through a psychological landscape, new vistas and variations and reminiscences of the primal theme of the entire symphony. Little by little, more of the chromatic, heart-wound harmonies come creeping into the revel until, as in the first movement, a great snarl of timpani, brass, and winds brings everything violently to a halt. The movement reaches psychological crisis. The strings now imploringly repeat strangely mournful major thirds. And we hear a driven and despairing version of the main tune. After this, nothing can ever be the same. Even though the strings launch into a new and flashy, almost Broadway final variation, the music simply loses its direction and runs down, becoming finally totally still. And now comes the event we've waited for the whole symphony and been so long denied. The return of the primal theme as we first heard it at the beginning of the symphony as a majestic chorale. long phrases spin out gloriously, ending each time on the 4 descending notes. Every time Sibelius restates the 4 descending notes, the emotional meaning is different. Each time, new harmonies frame a different scale and are used as if the very notes are crying out for resolution. The intensity of the confession is so undisguised. Sibelius cannot bear to sustain it. The voices of the chorale are suddenly choked, and we come to a silence. There's nothing left to say. The whole piece resolves not on D major or minor, not on Dorian, just on D, and then fades into a sustained silence. I think that when Sibelius wrote this piece, he knew the end of his creative journey was near. The sketches for the Sixth Symphony are highly disordered and seem to reflect a mind struggling to explore and record the dark emotions that were his lifelong inspiration. The Seventh Symphony, or Symphonic Fantasy, as Sibelius first and correctly titled it, was a spin-off of ideas that came from the Sixth. Tapiola, his last orchestral work, was a portrayal of the part of the forest where light never reaches. And then there was only the silence. For the rest of his life, he concentrated on his public image, accepting the awards and government pensions. His music was in, and then by his death, very much out of fashion. Now, to a new generation of performers, his music speaks freshly and daringly. Here to end this program is the complete Sixth Symphony in a performance especially for television by the London Symphony Orchestra. We have used figurative and non-figurative images, some derived from the performance of the music, some from other sources entirely. We've done this to try and explore visually the compositional processes Sibelius has used in this symphony. I hope this program may help to intrigue you and draw you closer to what is, for me, an unduly neglected masterpiece.